We are viewer funded. Support The Christian Truther by going to christiantruther.com/info for more information. Imagine a time when society's elite can literally say the masses are useless and it's time to depopulate. Amazon, Google, Facebook, and other CEOs of big tech companies are the gods now. Big data is the god now. Can you imagine a time when this rhetoric is mainstream? Sounds like 1984, doesn't it? Previously, we've discussed the New York Times best-selling author, Yuval Noah Harari. His book, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, he goes into, well, let's get into that. Yuval Noah Harari is the author of the international bestseller, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, 2014, and Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. In his books, Harari promotes a future filled with transhumanism, upgraded superhumans who dominate the world, and a technocratic elite class where big tech companies like Facebook and Amazon are the new gods. Not surprisingly, Mark Zuckerberg is an open supporter of Harari, stating his work is a big history narrative of human civilization. Well, the documented evidence on Harari just keeps piling up. His most recent report paints a picture of the future where the technocratic elite decide whether or not you and I are useful. And he even goes on to state that those who aren't useful won't last. While those who support Harari claim him to be an innovative thinker, we beg to differ. This article, these slides that you're about to see will prove that the statements Harari is making aren't anything new. They were first ideas of the society that pulls the strings of the United Nations, the Club of Rome, also known as the Lunatic Society. Microelectronics and Society, for Better or for Worse, was originally published in 1982 by the Club of Rome and contains the exact thoughts of Harari simply reworded. This right here proves that the current ideology of this takeover, this technocratic takeover, is not anything new. But guess what? We can go back even further from 1982. We can trace it all the way back to Marx, Karl Marx that is, who created and authored the Communist Manifesto. Their ideology is directly aligned with communism. We recently did a short film specifically on communism, the goals for a takeover of America, and how if you just compare the 45 goals to what's going on in society today, it is so apparent that this thing is so old. This agenda is so old. But yet they're still getting it through. Yet it's still happening in our society today. The takeover is not happening with guns and bullets and knives and tanks and nukes. Rather, it's happening with ideas, quote unquote. Our society is being ideologically subverted into communism. As we witness this cultural shift, we must remember that this is nothing new. These are ideas of old, rewrapped and repackaged and resold. And mainstream society is buying it with their eyes entirely closed. The Bible depicts perfectly what's going to take place. And it's happening now. These are the end times, and we must wake people up. Social and economic models we have inherited from the previous century might become utterly irrelevant in coming decades as the masses lose their economic value. In 2016, many Brits and Americans who had lost their economic usefulness but retained some political power used the ballot box to revolt before it's too late. They revolt not against an economic elite that exploits them, but against an economic elite that doesn't need them anymore. It is far more frightening to be useless than to be exploited. Of course, some new human jobs will develop in the 21st century, be it in engineering, software, or teaching yoga. Yet these will demand high levels of expertise and creativity, and will therefore not solve the problems of unemployed, unskilled laborers. During previous waves of automation, people could usually switch from one low-skill job to another. In 1920, a farm worker laid off because of the mechanization of agriculture could find a new job at a factory producing tractors. In 1980, an unemployed factory worker could start working as a cashier in a supermarket. Such occupational changes were feasible because they move from the farm to the factory and from the factory to the supermarket, required only limited retraining. But in 2040, a cashier or textile worker losing a job to an AI machine will hardly be able to start working as a software engineer or a yoga teacher. They will not have the necessary skills. In other words, the traditional working class will diminish or vanish, as was foreseen by Marx in the mid-19th century as an effect of automation. The same will to a large extent apply to farm laborers, clerks, and a considerable part of the people now employed in the services. But the various traditional jobs, especially those connected with intellectual functions, will remain, and in some cases, will absorb increased numbers of people, according to the hypothesis of this paper, namely that microelectronics will play the leading technical role within the next decade. There seems to be no room for an industrial or a post-industrial society. Both sectors, industry as a whole, and public and private services will lose employment possibilities which now exist, and agriculture will continue to replace workers and farmers through the effects of the so-called Green Revolution. With the rise of AI, robots, and 3D printers, cheap labor will become far less important, and demand for raw materials might also drop. Instead of manufacturing a shirt in Dhaka and shipping it all the way to New York, you could buy the shirt's code online from Amazon and print it in Manhattan. Zara and Prada stores could be replaced by 3D printing centers, and some people might even have such printers at home. The newly unemployed workers and call center operators in Dhaka and Bangalore don't have the education necessary to switch to designing fashionable shirts or writing computer code, so how will they survive? Under this scenario, the revenue that previously flowed to South Asia will now fill the coffers of a few tech giants in California, leading to a huge strain on developing economies. Such offshore assembly has brought considerable earnings to Asian and some Latin American countries, but it has some questionable features. It employs many low-paid, low-skilled workers in highly regimented and repetitive work, involving hours of manipulation done while peering through microscopes. Such work is not only costly when undertaken in the northern countries, but is subject to much stricter work and health regulation. The job creation resulting from such arrangements is likely to slow down considerably and may eventually disappear. Another major difficulty is that there is no accepted definition for, quote, basic needs. From a purely biological perspective, the only thing a Homo sapien needs for survival is about 2,500 calories of food per day. In their book, Mankind at the Turning Point, the depopulationists of the Club of Rome insert a table on page 194 that shows just how many calories a human needs to survive, as well as showing the amount of that should be protein. They too say that humans need 22 to 3,000 calories to live, which is a far cry from the American average caloric intake of 3,770. Hence, even if universal basic income means that poor people in 2050 will enjoy much better medical care and education than today, they might still feel that the system is rigged against them, that the government serves only the super rich, and that the future will be even worse for them and their children. Similarly, if in 2050 you tell the useless class that they enjoy better health care than in 2017, it might be very cold comfort to them because they would be comparing themselves to the upgraded superhumans who dominate the world. This ideology, there is something wrong with the people who are pushing this agenda, wouldn't you say? You see, this survival of the fittest ideology, this evolutionist ideology, this communist ideology, is where this really stems from. In conclusion, there is nothing novel about Yuval Harari's thoughts. His work is merely a carbon copy of the Club of Rome from the 1980s. And of course, the Club of Rome is a carbon copy from Karl Marx, which makes you wonder, who's really outdated now? I hope you all enjoyed this video. Please share it. God bless and carry on.